Man, it was a weekend of playoff action, wild card games in the NFL, and also we've got the wrap up of the bowl games and one more coming, and then it's over.
I'm in mourning.
Oh, somebody lost. It was cold.
Don't rub it in like that. That's very unkind of you.
I was sad because they're a scrappy, wonderful group
Yes,
of
they are. And
players.
they gave them a run for their money.
They really
tried to freeze them out, but it didn't work.
Well, that Kaepernick, I mean, who ever heard of playing in that weather in your shirt sleeves? I mean, it's
I know. Several of them played in their shirt sleeves.
And you hit the frozen ground with your flesh. Oh, man.
Yeah, you can't feel it by them.
They're tough. But in any event, they made it out, and the 49ers prevailed. They had the coach is a Christian. He's a nice guy, and so my solicitation to the stalwart people at Green Bay. They are tough fans, though.
Absolutely.
Fill those stands in that weather.
Rain, sleet, snow, or hail doesn't really apply to the post office. It's really about Green Bay fans.
Well, folks, in case you haven't heard, you can forget about global warming. By the way, there's a ship down in the Antarctic. They were down to study global warming, and they got frozen in, and the rescue ship got frozen in, and the next ship's frozen. I don't know.
A bit of a dichotomy.
We sent a Coast Guard cutter. Hope we can get through and get them out of there. But in America, it's so cold in some places, it's actually dangerous to your health. Wind chills as low as 65 degrees below zero. Think of that.
Forecasters say those wind chills will reach from Montana to Alabama, and they're coming after a major snowstorm. Caitlin Burke has the story.
It's the coldest air in nearly 2 decades, and it's expected to plunge temperatures to sub-zero lows.
It was just getting nice and balmy, 7 below.
The Arctic blast is the result of a whirlpool of frigid, dense air known as the polar vortex. And plummeting temperatures are putting more than half of the U.S. in a deep freeze. In Fargo, North Dakota, 25 below zero. In International Falls, Minnesota, -31, and -15 in Indianapolis and Chicago.
These are extremely dangerous conditions, and we strongly urge people to heed the warnings and take the necessary precautions to stay safe. If you can stay indoors, please do so.
And as if temperatures of 15 to 30 below aren't bad enough, in many areas, the wind chill will make it feel more like 50 to 60 below. With temperatures that low, frostbite can occur in only 5 minutes. Snow and ice are accompanying the cold in some areas, causing another round of travel problems. In New York on Sunday, this plane slid off the runway, and at Chicago O'Hare, more than 1,200 flights were canceled.
I just want to go home. I just want to get back settled in. We've been cooped up for 2 days.
School is called off Monday for the entire state of Minnesota, as well as cities and districts in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. Chicago officials said school would be in session, but absences would be excused. Authorities warn people to stay indoors when possible and to check on elderly and disabled relatives and neighbors. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
You know, Terry, for some reason, I've been out in that stuff. It's not all that cold.
That's the danger of it, though, because when it's so cold, you don't feel it.
Well, I was in Duluth. It was -20.
Yeah, well, Duluth, that's July.
Yeah, warm. I mean, I was in Bemidji, and we had a snowstorm, and I was in Spirit Lake, Iowa. It was a wind chill of -60. And, those people just get used to that stuff.
Yeah, well, they dress for it. And even, they even play in it,
I used to go out. I was in New Hampshire. I had a blazer. I had a wraparound.
Was this when you were campaigning?
Yeah. And it was 20 below zero, or 10 below zero.
Foolish. Why did you do that?
Huh?
Why did you do that?
Well, I had to show you're tough. I mean, I don't know what it was, but I wasn't cold.
Yeah, you don't feel it, though. It's dry, even in places that have humidity in the summer. When it's that cold, there's a dryness in the air.
So you live in that stuff. Wisconsin is that way.
Well, I have a little sign in my house that says I wasn't born in the South, but I got here as fast as I could. So.
Well, we Southerners welcome you, and it's been nice and warm, but I understand it's going to get to 13
It
here.
is. Tonight,
and here
it's going to drop drastically.
So I like to ride, and I've got a ring, and The way we test it, you take a screwdriver and push it into the soil, and if it goes down about an inch or so, then it's hard and you can't ride. So it's going to be, it's been in the 60s the last day or two, so it'll be warm enough to ride, and then it's going to freeze solid. So my poor horse, leave him in the barn.
Take a few carrots and rest for a couple of days. It'll come back.
Carrots and stall rest. Well, if you think the cold weather is bad, there's another threat of a natural disaster that's worse. We told you about it about 3 years ago, and John Jessup has that story now from Washington. Here's John.
Pat, volcanoes could be a greater threat to civilization than had been thought in years past. And one of those volcanoes is right here in the United States. The largest megavolcano in the world is located in Yellowstone, measuring 53 miles wide, and it's produced 3 of the world's most monstrous eruptions. As CBN News has previously reported, if it should erupt today, anyone within dozens of miles would be annihilated. Ash clouds would spread across the U.S., and it would block sunlight and push temperatures down by 9 to 15 degrees for years. That's according to a report from the Geological Society of London. Such events could result in the ruin of world agriculture, severe disruption of food supplies, and mass starvation. The effects could be sufficiently severe to threaten the fabric of civilization. It could also lead to as much as 1 billion casualties. Pat, those are some pretty staggering and sobering statistics.
That's a happy thought. I used to work in Yellowstone, and we went swimming in volcano. I mean, you know,
really, the springs?
Those little hot water springs. That were, but the whole thing is like one giant caldera, and but it's certainly pretty, and it's a national park, and I had a great summer.
There's no way you could prepare even for something like that.
I was pumping gas in a filling station out there for a couple of months, and it was pretty.
In your shirt sleeves, no doubt.
You better believe it. But at night, oh, it's cold. It was freezing at night. But Yellowstone is beautiful, but you don't realize that, you know, this Old Faithful, that geyser, it shoots up. Well, why? Because it's the middle of a volcano. But the lake, Yellowstone Lake, there were these little bubbling pools. They were volcanic little pools, and it was hot water. You could go swimming in it in the freezing cold. It was nice.
Well, fortunately, I think we have the kind of I don't know what you would call it, like equipment or whatever to gauge some of that, to give a warning if something like that was going to happen. But how would you even prepare for it? I mean,
you can't. If that thing blows, it'll have an ash cloud over the entire United States. It'll destroy America. So you pray. But that was Teddy Roosevelt, I believe, made a national park. But it is one beautiful place, and it was a nice place to work. So I spent a month or two, you know, all of my journeys in Yellowstone Park. John.
Pat, the National Security Agency can keep collecting every American's telephone records every day. That's the ruling from the secretive U.S. spy court that oversees some of the NSA's activities. The approval is the first since 2 conflicting court decisions about whether the program is constitutional. Senator Rand Paul is suing the government over the NSA spying practices. He wants it to stop snooping on the American people and says the agency's authority is too broad.
One single warrant should not apply to everybody who has a cell phone in America. So I think the idea of a class action lawsuit with hundreds of thousands of participants really beats home and brings to the forefront the idea that this is a generalized warrant and it should be considered unconstitutional.
A presidential advisory panel also recommended the NSA no longer be allowed to collect and search phone records without obtaining court approvals. Wisconsin Republican Senator Ron Johnson is suing a government agency for letting members of Congress and their staff get subsidies to help pay for Obamacare health plans. He says that wasn't part of the original bill. Now, that lawsuit comes as the Obama administration is asking the Supreme Court to lift an order against the law's contraception mandate requiring birth control, sterilization, and drugs that induce abortion. Last week, Justice Sonia Sotomayor issued that surprise decision, temporarily stopping the government from forcing the mandate on a group of nuns at the Little Sisters of the Poor Home for the Aged. The White House says it's offered exemptions and accommodations to churches and some nonprofit religious groups by letting insurance companies pay for birth control. But the nuns say the mandate violates their religious beliefs.
The way the rules are set up, that form will authorize and direct others to pay for those drugs, and the sisters simply can't be part of it. If the form doesn't matter, the government shouldn't be fighting to make the sisters sign it.
The Reverend Leith Anderson of the National Association of Evangelicals says the new health care law is putting religious liberty at risk. Well, studies have shown child abuse in America is much more widespread than people realize, and sometimes sexual predators are found even in the church. Now there's a growing movement to stop that and help survivors while protecting children. Heather Sells has that story.
The church should be the last place that parents worry about taking their children. But instead of providing a safe place for kids, child sexual abuse experts say church can actually be dangerous by providing a welcoming environment for predators.
We so focus on issues such as forgiveness and grace. Offenders are drawn to those places.
Former child abuse prosecutor Boz Chavijan says many churches unintentionally attract those who want to prey on children.
Churches are always in need of volunteers. I've never been to a church that was not in need of a volunteer, and churches are very trusting.
To help churches in the fight against this trend, Chavijan began the Grace Initiative, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. In recent years, he's seen progress as believers talk more openly about the problem. But what Chavijan would like to see now, more denominations and local churches developing policies that minister to survivors and protect kids.
You have to know about how offenders think and act so you can stay a step ahead or 2 steps ahead of them.
Often the biggest challenge for churches is learning how to respond to reports of abuse. That's because abusers have often been well-liked and trusted leaders.
When the 13 or 14-year-old kid in the youth group who's caused a lot of trouble in the youth group, who comes from a broken home, who maybe even has had some trouble with the law, when that 14, 15-year-old comes forward and says, this particular person in the church has sexually abused me, and that particular person happens to be an elder or a leader or a well-respected person in the church, how are we going to respond to that? Because that's where I see the breakdown.
Chavijan calls on churches to quickly take sexual abuse reports to the authorities and be prepared to minister to victims, offenders, and their families. This shedding of light on darkness, he says, is the best way for the church to move forward and demonstrate integrity in a fallen world. Heather Sells, CBN News.
1/3 of adults around the world are now either obese or overweight. That's nearly 1.5 billion people. A report from a British think tank found that the number of obese and overweight people has been rising rapidly in the developing world. It's nearly quadrupled since 1980. The Overseas Development Institute says the main reasons are diets with more sugar and fat, along with more people with sedentary lifestyles. The report warns of a major increase in obesity-related diseases, including diabetes, strokes, and heart attacks. Pat, this should really sound some alarm bells. What do you think should be done to address global obesity?
Abolish McDonald's, I suppose, is the way to do it. I'm being a little facetious, but really, it's the spread of the fast food industry. I mean, whether
and
it's
sugar, don't you think?
Well, yes, but we cook that way. You've got trans fats, and you have all these noxious things that are put into substances, and even the diets. I mean, we do high fructose corn syrup has been one of the leading causes of obesity in America, but they're using it now all over the world. So if you go into a McDonald's, then you find them big McDonald's store in Beijing, for example. They're going to get a super-sized Big Mac, and then they're going to get a great big thing of sugary drink, and it doesn't take many of those before people start getting fat. And it's across the globe, and we've picked it up. I mean, you go to London, it's the Wimpy's, it's some of the fast food chains, but that's what they use.
What's so curious about those numbers and the magnitude of them is that we've never had more information about how to eat well, what's healthy and what's not, and yet weight continues to be an issue.
If you're poor, you can't afford protein. And what you eat is starch. And so you could get bread cheaply, and you can get potatoes cheaply, and you can get, of course, other kinds of starchy type vegetables. Pastas especially, and they come cheap and they're filling. And so they make people fat. Okay.
Pope Francis is set to visit Israel this spring. The trip will commemorate the 50th anniversary of the historic meeting in Jerusalem between Pope Paul VI and the spiritual leader of the world's Orthodox Christians. After the visit, Francis will become the 4th pope to visit the Holy Land. CBN planned a special Christmas event for 300 underprivileged children in India. The day-long event was called the Light of Education Literacy Program and was sponsored by CBN's Orphans Promise. Children were encouraged to showcase their talents through skits, musical performances, and memorizing Bible verses. A local pastor also shared a Christmas message, and children were served lunch. At the end of the event, each child received a special gift. Orphans Promise reaches more than 1,200 children throughout India with its literacy centers. You can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international.